The topic I've chosen for today, the way I've framed today's talk, is called Authoritarians, Capitalists, and Industrial Eden Modernity in 20th Century China. And I'll explain each of these three things later on. But we have sort of three things going on. We have the authoritarians who are running China. We have the capitalists who are the subject of my research. And then we have their attempt to transform society and even save China through what I call an Industrial Eden style modernity. And so we'll talk about all three of those things today. As Clay mentioned, it took me 15 years to write this book. I did research in 8 different countries and 4 different languages. So it includes research in English, French, Chinese, of course, and Japanese. So let's begin. This is indeed the cover of the book. And this particular picture from the cover is the background for all of my slides. And so it comes from an internal newsletter that the company published. This company is called the Dongya Corporation. And in the internal newsletter, they have an individual here who is dressed as a runner, and he's running under a bright sun along a road. And his jersey says the Dongya Corporation, so it's the name of the company is on his jersey. And the road that he's running along is the factory precept. This is a kind of slogan or a rule of thumb that the factory posted all over where workers were working. And it is essentially the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I've used the standard English for that. And it is inspired partly by Christianity, but it's also a phrase which comes from the Confucian tradition. And the Chinese version of this is the Confucian version. Okay? But when we translate it to English, we usually use the Christian version here. But just to remember that it has both those meanings for Chinese in the early 20th century. It's both representative of a Christian idea and also representative of a very ancient Chinese idea. And so we have the idea of the corporation, the factory, the industry running a race, and it is indeed a race, and I'll explain that a little bit later, but to try to transform China, but to do so by creating a new kind of citizen or new kind of person, one who will abide by, among other things, the precept to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Okay. So I'm going to talk about what I like to think about this as sort of a mid-20th century moment. And this is a moment that is seen not exactly the same, but we have sort of complementary things going on in many different places of the world at the time. Okay. This moment in China is framed by a prolonged political crisis that begins in the middle of the 19th century and goes all the way up until about 1950, maybe even 1970 or 1980, depending on how you want to do it. But it's over a century of prolonged political crisis, and this is the most important context we have to keep in mind. Western imperialism has come to China. Japanese imperialism has come to China. There's attacks on Chinese sovereignty. And almost constant war, at least for the last part of this period. And so there's this prolonged political crisis that people like my individuals, and I'll talk about them in a moment, are dealing with. But to get back to the idea of the mid-20th century moment, one of the things that we have here is authoritarian governments set on economic development. And this sounds not so unusual to us today, but this is a fairly new thing in the mid-20th century, that you have governments who feel it's their obligation to do something about economic development. And in this case, they're authoritarian governments, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And I apologize, apparently I didn't quite balance my slides, so we cut off a couple words here. Okay. We have capitalists, and there's one particular capitalist family, which I'll tell you about in a moment. These are capitalists who are looking for state help. Mm-hmm. In all the research that I did, there was never a time when they said to the state, go away, we believe in free markets, we believe in laissez-faire, we want to do our own thing. It was, what can you do to help us develop? We are competing with other countries. We're competing with Japanese firms. We're competing with European firms. We need your help. And the only way that we can sort of use the corporation to transform China is by getting some sort of partnership help from the state. And then the third thing we have is a model of modernity which is derived from 2 different things. One is industrial organization, and the second is consumer culture. And sort of how these 2 things come together, the idea of new kinds of industry, sort of 19th century industrial revolution kinds of industry, combined with a particular kind of 20th century consumer culture. Okay? And we can see these same 3 things replicated in many different places around the world in the mid-20th century: Germany, Italy, Turkey, other places as well. Okay. My story takes place in North China. The family is the Song family. It's spelled S-O-N-G, kind of like the word song, but it's pronounced Song. It's the Song family. You may have heard of a Song family from the 20th century that's very famous. It's not that Song family. It's not the TV Song Meiling family. It's a different Song family. This one comes from North China, from a very, very poor village near the city of Qingzhou here in Shandong province. Eventually, although the father will establish his businesses here, eventually the family will move to the city of Tianjin here in North China. So almost everything we talk about today is going to take place here in North China, either near Qingzhou or mostly in the city of Tianjin. Okay? So that just kind of locates where we are. So here's our family. The father's name is Song Chuandian, and I don't have a picture of him, but so I gave you a picture of his business. This is the business that he eventually builds in the provincial capital of Shandong province. His name is Song Chuandian. He's born horribly poor in a family of illiterate peasants in the Shandong countryside in the 1870s. Eventually goes to missionary school. They're British Baptist missionaries in this part of China. He gets a missionary education, and then he uses that education to go into business. And I don't have a lot of time to give you the details of that business today, but he will become the most famous and richest person in Shandong province, okay, through this business. And eventually will become head of the Shandong Provincial Assembly. And it's widely reported that he did so through bribery, that he paid 180,000 Chinese yuan, which is an incredible fortune at the time, like just Bill Gates kind of money, practically, to become head of the Shandong Provincial Assembly. In one of the political changes that I'll talk about in a moment, he falls out of favor with the government and has to flee. His assets are confiscated and the family has to rebuild. And it's done under his son, this gentleman here. His name is Song Feiqing. For those of you who aren't familiar with the rules of Hanyu Pinyin, if you see a Q, it's pronounced kind of like the light CH. So it's Feiqing, not Feiqing. And he builds a company in Tianjin called the Dongya Corporation, the one that you saw a moment ago on the jersey of the runner from the newsletter. And they make wool knitting yarn, and their brand is called the Budding Ram brand. And the budding rams here actually symbolize the collision of China with the outside world and competition for the Chinese market. And so here we see an advertisement for their yarn, and I'll get back to sort of what this advertisement represents. But the whole idea is to buy the Dongya Corporation's knitting yarn because it's Chinese made. It's a Chinese good. You can be patriotic as well as fashionable. So this is the ad that they have for their main product. And I'll come back to this idea of, remember, getting back to the industrial Eden model for modernity, one of the posts or pillars that it rests on is a kind of consumer culture. So we'll get back to this idea of consumer culture later in the talk. Okay. So let's talk about authoritarians. And I'll just begin with a joke. I'm not trying to control you. I only want you to control yourselves in accordance with my specifications. Okay. So what does it mean to be authoritarian? Right? The definition that I use in my book is that authoritarian is a system in which a leader or small group exercises power without formal limits. Okay. Now, every leader has limits. No leader is all-powerful, right? There's always limits just to capacity as to what you can do. But there's a difference between those limits that are just sort of constraints on resources or constraints on abilities and those limits that are formal limits. So when I'm talking about formal limits, what might I be talking about? Let's take the United States as an example. What are the formal limits in the United States? Yes? The system of checks and balances, that we have three independent branches of government, the executive, the judicial, and the legislature, and that they were supposed to check and balance each other. It's a formal limit on power. What else do we have in the United States? Freedom of the press. Freedom of the press. It is a formal limit in the sense that it's enshrined in the Constitution that we have freedom of the press, right? And so that's sort of formally constituted in this idea that you can then criticize the government, right? And that brings us back, of course, to the Constitution, which is the ultimate formal limit on state power, that the Constitution sort of rules over everything, that all power is limited by what's in the Constitution. Okay. We may not always follow it, but nonetheless, it's a formal limit. Okay. Governments that ruled China throughout the 20th century, and there were constitutions, there's a constitution in China today, they are still authoritarian because they don't accept that as a formal limit on their power. That doesn't have sort of dispositive force over the actions of government. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the regimes that ruled China from the end of the 19th century up until the present. And my book doesn't cover quite all of these, but just to sort of give you an idea for the scope of the changes that China is going through at this time. So we begin with China's last dynasty, the Qing dynasty. It's followed by a period of disunity that we usually call the warlord period. I just use a warlord's picture here, but there are many of them. There's dozens, if not more, people who are fighting for control of China. They might control a province or a part of a province or a county, and they try to get resources to build armies and fight with each other to see who's going to control China. We call that the warlord period. Eventually, they are replaced by a regime under this guy. His name is Chiang Kai-shek. You may have heard of him. And his regime is called the Nationalists. Okay? And I distinguish here between the pre-war and the post-war Nationalists, and I'll get back to that. So we have the pre-war Nationalists. So they take power in 1927 and 1928, and they will rule until the beginning of World War II. Okay? They will still continue to rule parts of China after the Japanese invasion. Japan invades China in 1937. But my part of China, that we're talking about in my book, in North China, becomes part of the Japanese empire. Okay? It's ruled by a puppet Chinese government, but it is, for all intents and purposes, part of the Japanese empire. It is occupied, so we call this the Japanese occupation. And this is just random Japanese soldier picture that I got off of like a Google image search. That's nobody in particular. Okay? Japan loses the war. Spoiler alert. No. We all know Japan loses World War II and are replaced by the nationalist government, the same government that had ruled North China prior to the Japanese invasion. But notice I used a different picture of Chiang Kai-shek here. So he's still in power, but I argue in my book that the regime after the war is very different from the regime before. That the process of fighting the Japanese in that war and then taking over the Japanese occupied territories has changed the regime in very important ways, and I argue in the book, very toxic ways. It becomes a very toxic kind of regime. Another spoiler alert, the Nationalists actually lose to another party. They lose to the Communists. And so we have the next regime that takes control is the Maoist regime under the PRC. I've put it in a red frame. I'll explain that in a moment. And Mao rules until 1976. After his rule, we get still ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, still the People's Republic of China, but a very different kind of regime within that framework. And I've used a picture of Deng Xiaoping here, but there are other leaders who will come along, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao among them, but we'll just use Deng Xiaoping as the kind of representative of this period. And then finally, the regime today, which is the Xi Jinping era. And I would argue, although it's not in my book doesn't extend as far, that we're seeing yet a new kind of regime within the PRC. So all three of these in the red frame, those are all the People's Republic of China under rule by the Chinese Communist Party. But I would argue that they are nonetheless three distinctly different regimes. Okay? Industrial Eden sort of covers these. It begins in the warlord period, although Song Chuandian is born in the end of the Qing dynasty. He really makes his money and his mark beginning in the warlord period. It goes through the pre-war nationalists, the Japanese occupation, the post-war nationalists, and the very early PRC regime. In addition, I have a final chapter in the book that covers the legacy of the Song family throughout the rest of the Maoist regime and then on into the post-Mao China. So this sort of my book covers those regimes in China. And I frame it as sort of the story of one capitalist family under 5 successive authoritarian regimes. 6 if we count the legacy under the post-Mao era. And it's the way of looking at change over this incredibly tumultuous period of time in China by following how one family kind of reacts and survives and adapts to all of these different changes. And so here's the interesting thing. All of these regimes are mutually hostile, right? The nationalist revolution was intended to destroy the warlords. The Japanese occupation fought the nationalist regime in an 8-year-long invasion and war. The nationalists are not hostile to the nationalists, so that, beyond that. But the nationalists and communists fought a bloody 20-year-long civil conflict ending in a horrible 4 years of civil war. All of these regimes are mutually hostile to each other, but the Song family manages to have good working relationships with all of them. They're capitalists, and yet they can cooperate with the warlords. They can do so again with the nationalists. They work well with the occupation regime. They even work under this toxic post-war regime, and they work well, at least for the very beginning, of the Maoist period. And that, to me, that just strikes me as really amazing and something that tells us a lot about the nature of the relationship between authoritarianism and capitalism. Okay? And I'll get back to that. Okay. Somewhere beginning here in the warlord period begins the pattern where all of these are developmental states. Okay? Some of the, the warlord period is not unified, so we can't characterize one warlord regime. But some of the warlords actually saw their role as developmental. And so that's why I have a dashed line here under the warlords, and then it becomes a solid line under the nationalists. Beginning here, somewhere in the early 20th century, let's say in the 19-teens or 1920s, suddenly every Chinese state believes that they have the obligation to grow China's economy and that they should have a role in the growth of that economy. It isn't just sort of setting up a framework and letting the economy grow on its own, but it's one in which the state should direct, channel, guide, bring about through its own forces that kind of economic development. Okay. This is very new, right? Qing dynasty had a few policies that might be sort of developmental. They certainly tried to regulate rice prices and do a few things like that, but there was no idea that their economic growth should be a standard to achieve, and there was no idea that there should be large-scale state intervention in the economy to do so. They intervene in the economy here and there, mostly for revenue generation, but this idea of development is something that emerges pretty much in the 19th century. And most states in the world today are developmental states, even the United States, right? When we elect congressmen or presidents, we say, well, what are they going to do for the economy? And the United States has very specific policies. They're usually done through the tax code or other things like that, so it doesn't seem so obvious. In a lot of places, states just own factories, or they invest in things, or they pick winners and losers. But nonetheless, even the United States has its own developmental side to it. So it's a factor of most of the states in the world today. Certainly a factor of the Chinese states. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean when I say developmental state. Okay. If we think of a range of kinds of state relationships to the economy. On one end, we have laissez-faire. And that means the state takes little role, does little interference in the economy, right? The other end, we have an extractive state. We have a state which tries to control the economy to withdraw resources for its own purpose, okay? And there's a variety of extractive states out there. I suppose one that might make sense to people in the room would be, say, Saddam Hussein's regime, right? That's sort of extracting oil wealth for particular purposes, although he even had developmental policies as well. And then somewhere in the middle of this range, I would put the developmental state. This is a state which tries to control resources, okay? But it also tries to do so in a way that develops the economy. Okay? And we normally think of this in sort of two different versions. The socialist developmental state, one in which the means of production are owned and controlled by the state, and one in which there's perhaps a capitalist economy. And when we think of capitalist developmental states, we often think of post-war Japan, perhaps South Korea, perhaps Singapore. Singapore might be the example. A fairly large part of the Singapore economy is actually state-owned. Maybe Taiwan, where the state has taken a very direct role in trying to channel investment and to guide particular developmental policies. So where do the authoritarian regimes of China's 20th century sit? If we think of a chart where we have on the top sort of laissez-faire economy versus developmental state versus extractive state, and down here is the idea of sort of democratic political system versus authoritarian political system, kind of where do all these regimes of China's 20th century sit? Okay. This is not perfect, this is not exact. We could argue states are different at different times. The pre-war nationalists for 10 years, they might have moved around somewhere. But every one of these states is authoritarian at some level. They have no formal limits on power. Okay? They may make claims to democracy or to consultative forms of one or another, and I've sort of raised some of those up that said they're kind of claiming that they have some sort of democratic institution at work, but they are all, for my purposes and for my definition, authoritarian states. And with the exception of the Qing dynasty and some of the warlords, they all fall somewhere between the developmental and extractive ranges here. You know, at some points they extract resources just for their own survival. There's this idea that the state is somehow autonomous or partly autonomous from society, and its survival is important, and so they extract resources for that purpose. Other times they have policies which are supposed to be developmental. Okay. Let's think of another way of looking at China's 20th century regimes. Here it's not democracy versus authoritarianism, it's private ownership versus state ownership. Okay? And so, you know, we go back to the Qing dynasty, it was mostly private ownership. The dynasty had a couple of sort of monopoly operations, salt production being one of them, but for the most part, production was in private hands, agricultural production and industrial or artisan production as well. The warlords also generally private ownership, although a few warlords not. The farther we go to the other regimes, the more state ownership we get. The pre-war nationalists less so, but they were moving in the direction towards state ownership of certainly industry. And by the post-war nationalists, they're actually a huge role in state ownership. So, you know, these two slides might be surprising to some people. You know, a lot of times we tell the story of 20th century China by telling the story of states which are very different from each other ideologically, that are mutually hostile to each other, that fight all the time. And that's true of all of these states. But from this perspective, from the perspective of the Song family trying to deal with them, these states are actually a lot alike. They all seem obligated to develop China in some way or another, and they're all authoritarian. Okay, so in my book, I've sort of named the kinds of developmental states that we see here, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But you know, I call the warlords, for example, they're sort of varied. There's varied there. Some of them are extractive, and some of them are not. The pre-war nationalists I call an uncertain developmental state because the policies that they use to help Song Feiqing and the Dongya Corporation work sometimes, don't work others, are enforced sometimes, or unenforced by others. The big story is that when Song Feiqing starts his corporation, he feels that he has unfair competition from Japanese and European knitting yarn manufacturers. And so he goes to the state and he says, we need tariffs. You know, you need to slap tariffs on these imports. Sounds a little familiar to us today in the United States. The tariffs on imports is a big topic in the United States today. We need tariffs on imports, we need tax breaks, and we need shipping breaks when we ship stuff on state railroads. And at that time, the nationalist regime, we're talking about the pre-war nationalists here, brand new regime, they needed money. They needed to do their own share of extraction. But they had policies that were supposed to help Chinese industry. And yet it's really unclear why they help some industries and not others. Not everybody gets this kind of treatment. And that's why I talk about the uncertain developmental state. And there's one story that a former Dongya employee tells that he goes to the capital and he meets with officials and he gives one a set of beautiful woolen underwear, long underwear that you would wear in the winter. And that's what tips the balance. And suddenly he signs off and he gives him a sheet and says, yes, we will give to, you know, we'll increase tariffs, we'll give you tax breaks and all of that. And that story is probably not entirely true. It's not the entire picture. But it's representative of the idea that this is a state that is sometimes developmental, you know, sometimes helps industry and sometimes does not. And does so in unpredictable ways. Japanese occupation, I have extractive / developmental. Extractive, certainly. It is a conquering occupation regime. They are trying to extract resources. But they're trying to do so to develop a larger Japanese empire. So from their standpoint, they're a developmental regime, right? They're trying to develop their parts of China as part of the Japanese empire. From the Chinese standpoint, they look very extractive. You're taking resources away from us for your purposes. Interestingly enough, the Dongya Corporation does very well under Japanese occupation. They make lots of, this is probably their best time. Okay, they make lots of money during the Japanese occupation. Partly because they can no longer get the Australian wool imports they need to make their yarn, and so they shift to making gunny sacks. I bet nobody in my class knows what a gunny sack is. What's a gunny sack? Anybody? It's a cloth bag. We used to use these before we had like plastic bags. It's a cloth bag, and just think back to the world before plastic bags, before container ships, before all of that. Every time we needed to transport something like rice or soybeans or cement or anything like that, you had to put it in a bag. And so they made gunny sacks, and these gunny sacks became very important to, among other things, the Japanese army. So they made gunny sacks and sold them to the Japanese army, and they made lots of money. And this money helped finance this version of modernity that I'm going to tell you. So at the same time that they would claim they're a patriotic corporation trying to save China from foreign encroachment, they're using their position in the Japanese regime to promote their version of modernity. And I'll get back to that in a moment. Okay. Post-war nationalists, I call it unresponsive developmental state. They have their own toxic problems. I won't go into that. And then the early Maoist PRC, the People's New Democratic Developmental State. And this refers to the Maoist policy of new democracy, where he says, we need a big tent. We need lots of different kinds of people to come together to cooperate together with the Communist Party, including capitalists. That capitalists can be good and can be part of the new China. It's a very short period. It lasts maybe 2 years. But nonetheless, it's a period in which the Dongya Corporation and the Song family have a very good working relationship with the Communist Party, even though the communists are technically anti-capitalist, right? It's really interesting. Right after the communists take the city of Tianjin, the new Communist Party mayor of Tianjin meets with Song Feiqing and refuses to shake his hand because he's raised on Marxism, right? He's the idea that capitalism is evil, that we are here to deliver the workers from the capitalist exploitation, and I can't, as a good communist, be polite to a capitalist. And yet the Communist Party realizes that they need the capitalists to get the economy moving again. They have very limited supplies of talent, especially educated talent. China's a very big place, and they need the capitalists. And so eventually, the Communist Party will send the number 2 man in the party, his name is Liu Shaoqi, to Tianjin, and he whips labor into shape. He says, you have got to stop protesting. You have got to stop making demands. Yes, true, we are going to create a workers' paradise, but right now, you need to get back to work. And he tells the capitalists, if you cooperate with us, we'll be nice to you. He meets with Song Feiqing and he tells him, you're managing one company now. Great, you manage it. You make as much money as you want. You need to get back to work. If you manage it well, maybe we'll give you 10 factories to manage. At some point, we'll take your factories away from you because we're going to be communists, we're going to socialize them, but that's fine. We'll hire you to run them. And everything will go on just as it's planned. In a very famous meeting, he comes to the Dongya Corporation. This is the number 2 man in the Chinese Communist Party. He comes to the Dongya Corporation, and I have a great description of him. He's a chain smoker. He smokes 2 packs of cigarettes while he meets with the workers. And then he sits down with Song Feiqing, and he says, how many people have you laid off, right? Because China's gone through this whole civil war. Production is not good. There's no material. And he says, we need to bring the workers back. You need to put your workers to work. You need to get the factory running. We need to build the economy. And Song Feiqing looks at this communist and he says, but the Communist Party tells me that employing workers is exploiting them, that I'm an exploiter. And Liu Shaoqi, number 2 man in the Communist Party, looks back and says, right at the moment, we want you to exploit a few more people. That exploitation can make a contribution. 剥削有功, for those of you who speak Chinese. Exploitation can make a contribution. Now, for those of you who know something about Chinese history, you know that Liu Shaoqi will live to regret these words. That he and Mao Zedong are not friends, that he will become a major target later on under Mao's China, and that this will come back to haunt him. At the moment, he's working under party directives to get the economy going, and he figures this is the way to do it. Later on, they'll be said, you said that it was good to exploit people, and then he will be pilloried for that. And he'll die a horrible death in jail. Okay. But that's getting beyond the story here. Okay. So what do I learn by following this one capitalist family under all of these different authoritarian regimes? Okay. All of China's modern states combine developmental and extractive characteristics. Okay. They were at some level autonomous from the societies in which they ruled, and believed that their survival, the survival of the regime, was as important as any other goal in society. But at the same time, they all had developmental goals, that they believed building China's economy was not just a good thing to do, but something the state should be responsible for. I learned that businesses dealt with states on 2 levels. So you have the developmental extractive policy level. So if the state has a policy that says we're going to put up tariffs to sort of decrease imports and give you space to increase domestic production, or if we're going to have policies that allow us to invest in your firm or whatever it happens to be, so they deal with that sort of on a policy level. But much more often, they deal with these states on an ex officio level, under the table. because these are authoritarian states with no formal limits on power. And that means that certain members of those states can use their positions for personal gain. And so they're bribable. And they're bribable. All states have corrupt members in them, right? But authoritarian states tend to be more corrupt than others because there are no checks and balances. There are no limits on their formal power. And so the agents of these states can use their position to extract personal gain. Okay? And this is much of what the Dongya Corporation does. It uses under-the-table bribery and other kinds of sort of benefits to different agents of these regimes as a means of surviving and sometimes even thriving. And you also learned that these businesses had increasing expectations of state developmental policies. That, as I say once again, they weren't sitting around saying, oh, we need free markets, we want a laissez-faire state. They were saying, do something. Give us loans. Cut our interest rates. Provide channels of distribution. Raise tariffs. Do something to help us out. Okay? The idea was that China's political crisis was in such a condition, China's developmental level was in such a condition, and just the whole sort of fetishization of free markets that we often talk about in our country just didn't exist. Nobody talked about free markets. It just wasn't even on people's radar. Okay, so that's kind of the story of the capitalists and the authoritarians. Okay? But I want to talk a little bit more about the transformative role of the corporation, at least what Song Feiqing saw as the transformative role of the corporation. And if you look around and think about it, here in the United States today, or in the world today, corporations are some of the most powerful institutions we have. We have Uber, for example. Uber has completely transformed our lives. For the young people in the room, you probably don't remember what it was like not to have Uber because you were children and your parents drove you everywhere anyway. But just the fact that Uber exists, it completely undermines previous systems of public mass transportation and parking structures even. There's parking structures that are hurting because people are using Uber and not driving their cars. And the whole sort of system of licensing monopoly taxis is all in crisis because Uber has come along. And we have all these corporations out there that are transforming the world in ways that we're not even clear about. This is not just a phenomenon of the 21st century. Back in the 1920s and 30s, Song Feiqing saw that the corporations should have this role. And he believed that industrial corporation in particular should have a role in transforming not just China, not just developing the economy, just not making China's economy stronger, but also a role in developing new kinds of citizens. A new kind of relationship between the people and their society. So let's get back to our ad here for the Dongya knitting yarn. I love this ad. This is one of my favorite ads. The ad itself makes much about the fact that it's a patriotic good and that it's Chinese made, although they're using imported Australian wool. But nonetheless, it's marketed as a Chinese made good. But everything here, the dog with the chain, right? The idea that you have sort of pets that are run around on a leash, the style of these are of course knitted sweaters, right? So knitting yarn, they're selling knitting yarn. The style of the sweaters, the hats, even the so-called Chinese dress. This is called a qipao. This is a modern 20th century invention. It's thought of as traditional Chinese dress, but it's a brand new invention, right? This is stylish modernity, Western influence kind of consumer culture that they're selling to the Chinese as a way of being patriotic and transforming yourselves and partaking in a kind of larger modernity in a patriotic way. And the various components of this, I say they're a patriotic emulation of Western fashion, family life. One of the ways that the Dongya Corporation sells knitting yarn is they publish a women's magazine. And the women's magazine has all kinds of advice. How do you manage a household budget? How does a modern housewife manage a household budget? And what does she do? How do you teach your children about sex? How do you deal with the larger extended family? How do you knit? Of course, there's always instructions on how do you knit and how do you make fashionable clothes because they are selling knitting yarn. But nonetheless, they saw their mission as something much, much larger, to transform the very ways that people lived their daily lives. And we see that here. Most Chinese did not live like this, right? Most Chinese could not afford to dress like this or have pets or do anything like this. But this was a model that was being held up of a different kind of modernity that they thought that the corporation could help promote. Okay. That's kind of part of this industrial Eden modernity. The other of it is one that really appreciates the beauty and utility of industry. And so this is taken from a 1940s company publication, and it's a very artsy picture of the factory, right? They've got the fence, and you've got the bars, and you've got the water tower, and the factory's in the background. And you know, we can go back to the 1920s all over the world, and we see muralists and photographers and people taking similar kinds of pictures. The appreciation of the beauty of industry, even though it's kind of smoke belching, toxic chemical producing kind of thing, right? It was seen as a beautiful force because it would increase production, increase economic wealth, and just the way it all kind of fit together had a kind of aesthetic beauty to it. Okay? And so he combines all these ideas into what I call in the book Industrial Eden. It's not a phrase that Song Feiqing ever used, but because he was a Christian, remember his father had gone to missionary schools, I think the Eden is apt. You know, he's trying to create a kind of paradise here, right? But it's one that is based on industry and based on the power of the corporation to transform society. Mm-hmm. And it is one of a number of attempts at what I call redemptive industrialization to save China and transform it. And so we can go all over China, and there's all kinds of other factory owners out there who are doing similar kinds of things. Okay? And this is what I call an industrial Eden model of development. It's redemptive industrialization. So the way I approach it in the book is there's sort of two sides to the industrial Eden model of modernity. There's one that's sort of outside the company and one that's inside the company. So let me talk briefly about outside the company. We've already talked about it. It has to do with promoting a kind of household management, family management, and fashion style that will revolutionize society. And so we see here the knitting classes. You have to teach people to knit if you want to sell knitting yarn. So you know the idea that knitting, and I don't know if you know, if your grandmothers even knit? That's maybe your great-grandmother's knit. I don't know. It used to be my grandmother knit. You know, we think of that as kind of quaint and old-fashioned, but in the 1920s and 30s, this was sort of the cutting edge of being Western and fashionable and modern. Okay? And we can see that in these advertisements here. We can see it in sort of the Art Deco decorations. We see sort of movement and speed and sort of dynamism here. We see fashion and even sex appeal here. And you know, the idea that knitting yarn is part of this larger consumer modernity that they're trying to promote. Then we have industrial Eden inside the company. And this is one of the most interesting parts of, I think, of the book. Here we see Song Feiqing talking to his workers. And so he held weekly lectures. And he would talk to them about all kinds of things. One lecture might be on how you're supposed to dress, and that you need to keep your clothes neat and button your buttons and zip your zippers and be presentable to the world. Or he might have a lecture on the need to bow to your superiors and to sort of recognize them and to be, or he might have a lecture on the need to work hard and to be honest, or you know, a million. And not only would he give them lectures, then the personnel department would actually test their workers. And I found one of these tests, the records of one of these tests. They would sit down and ask questions on the content of the lectures, and the workers would have to respond. Many of the workers lived in company dormitories, so they lived and worked in their same place. And that gave the company tremendous amounts of power to affect their lives. And so they had to get up and go to sleep at certain times of the day. They had to make their beds and do all of those kinds of things. There were also all kinds of company clubs. They could go to a drama club. And there were two drama clubs. There was a Western drama club, so they could go do Shakespeare and Ibsen on one day. And there was a Chinese drama club, and they could go do Chinese opera. They could take part in a soccer team and play soccer. There was a chess club. There was a night school where they could go and learn to be literate. There was all this stuff for workers to do to make them better people and to sort of discipline them in the ways of industrial modernity. And so I want to give you an example of the discipline here, and this refers to this picture down here. So at one point, the Dongya Corporation needed to hire some new employees. And he was going to hire about 5. And it puts an ad in the paper, and it gets hundreds of applicants. Hundreds. And they decide they want mostly college-educated people for this particular job. So they bring them to the factory, and they put them through a series of tests. And the first test is, Song Feiqing and the other executives sit and they sit in an auditorium and they ask each applicant to walk across the stage. And then they take notes. Does this person stand up straight? Well, I'm dead because I've slouched my entire life. I just hear my mother like, stand up, okay. Right? Do they stand up straight? Do they walk with a limp? Do they have energy? Okay? Completely kind of arbitrary, superficial, might not even be representative of how this person is. And then they eliminated a whole bunch of people. Then they had them do dexterity tests. Like they'd give them a wooden plaque with like little holes in it, and they'd have to like put little pegs in those holes as quickly as they could. And then they would give them tests on their mathematical abilities and their tests on other kinds of abilities. And then they had to have a physical exam. Not just to see if they had tuberculosis or some debilitating disease, to see if they were prime specimens of sort of virile Chinese masculinity. Because these were all men in this particular. They had women employees, but not in this particular thing. You know what these men were being hired for? They were being hired to be cost accountants in the cost accounting department. For those of you in Marshall, aren't you glad that you don't have to go through this kind of an interview, right? But there was this idea that all these things were linked, that the health of the individual, the health and the virile nature of the individual, their dexterity, their mane, their posture, all of these things counted into making a new kind of citizen. Yeah?
Did they do this for other departments, or were accountants considered extra special?
Okay. You know, not all the tests for every department, because not all departments had math tests, for example. But I interviewed former workers, and they would arrive, and the first thing they would do is that someone would stand there and they'd have to walk in a circle around them. And then they would also have a different kind. A lot of their tests were administered orally because they were not literate necessarily, and so but they would be asked questions about like, what would you do here or there. So there were similar kinds of things, maybe not quite as involved as the cost accountants. Yeah.
Did this type of company culture only start after his son, Song Feiqing, or was it like
there are traces of it in his father's company. Okay, there's traces of it. For example, his father's employees all had to go to church on Sunday. They all had to live, not all of them, but a lot of them lived in a dormitory. There's traces of it, but it really only comes to fruition in the 1930s under Song Feiqing, and the 1940s too. Yeah. Okay. So there's this idea that industrial Eden is appealing in many ways. It's about consumer culture. We're all, whether we like it or not, we're all active participants in consumer culture. We all buy stuff, right? I'm sure we all have smartphones, right? It's about consumer culture, but a particular kind of consumer culture. It's also about standing up straight and wearing the right clothes, but it's about also a kind of discipline, about not going outside the lines, about not having a kind of individual identity, about towing the line and doing certain things, and always being, even in your home life, being part of a larger project, that you don't have any home or private space. And in fact, Dongya had, their personnel department would make home visits for people that didn't live in the factory, and they would go and they would to check and see who was home and how they were living and whether it was clean or whether it was dirty. And it's a vision of modernity that is inspired by industry, by regulation, by having everything done the same, by sort of cutting tasks up into divisible parts. And it's a version of modernity that's inspired by a picture of a society that is clean and orderly and dynamic, and potentially very boring if it would ever really happen, right? It never will happen, right? It sort of reaches its height during the war profiteering years under the Japanese occupation. By the end of World War II, there's horrible inflation in China. There's a lot of labor strife, and sort of the industrial Eden is only made possible when they have enough money to really kind of essentially pay for it, bribe their workers into to say, oh, this is great, why not, right? A lot of these workers, by the way, I interviewed them, their former workers, they were very loyal to this whole system. A lot of them kind of drank the Kool-Aid, and there's a lot about it that's appealing. But it is a model that, in the end, sort of emphasizes things like discipline, a perception of scientific rationality, that there's one right way to do stuff because it's scientific, right? For example, there was a company barbershop, and everybody had to get their hair cut on a regular rotation schedule because it's all scientific, right? Okay. And it has an eerie similarity to the kinds of authoritarian goals that we see from the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party. The kinds of ideas they had about what makes a good citizen, what makes a good person, how do we relate to larger institutions like the state or the companies we work for, has kind of an eerie sort of similarity there that I think gives us reason to be suspicious of the industrial Eden model of modernity and its potential implications. So there's sort of my book in as few words as I could possibly make it.